Hello and welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 for 2018, brought to you in partnership with Barclays Access, the Paciello Group, Intopia, Microsoft Edge, and Open Access Technologies. Don't forget, you can subscribe to the ID24 YouTube channel by heading to youtube.com/Inclusive Design 24. And don't forget, you can also follow us on Twitter at IDConf. And if you have any questions for Eriol or any of our presenters, you can send them via Twitter using the ID24 hashtag.
So next up, we have Eriol Fox, who's going to be talking to us about diversity in design. Take it away, Eriol.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. So I'm very excited to present to you the diversity in design talk that I've been doing for a couple of years now, actually. So in this talk, I cover things like illustration, photography, UI and UX, so what you could describe as visual design elements. And this is all from a marginalized perspective, which is my own perspective. So a lot of these are my own experiences, my own conversations I've had with colleagues or friends, and some of it is what is covered in related reading as well. I recommend a lot of books during this talk. I am a big avid reader, so get ready for a long book recommendation list. So this talk also presents a lot of questions, not necessarily a lot of answers to those questions. It's a lot to do with how you interpret the discussion topics that I'm bringing to the table here. And it's mostly to provoke the thinking around these topics, to introduce these topics into more conversations in workplaces. So I'm just going to recap the content warnings here. So just be aware that there is talk about misgendering, ableism, which is the discrimination against people with disabilities or impairments, racism, visual representations of transgender people, LGBTQIA+ representation, and ageism. So a little bit about me. My name is Eriol. I am a designer, and I've had many job titles in my career, from things as specific as UI designer to more generalist titles of designer. I tend to go with designer now, just because I do so many different kinds of design functions. I am a non-binary person and trans, regardless of what people think I may look like. So non-binary is a way of identifying outside of the gender binary. There are other ways of identifying outside of the gender binary as well, such as agender or gender fluid. And it's dependent on the individual as to what it really means to them. It means, for me, I'm neither man nor woman, and I fluctuate between the two sometimes. And the best way to find out about this, if somebody identifies as non-binary, is to ask them respectfully. So I use they, them, their pronouns, and I use the title MX, which is pronounced MUX, or mix in some places, instead of Mr., Mrs., or Ms. So I'm a queer person as well. So I'm on part of the LGBTQ+ community. And I have an invisible disability, an illness, PTSD. I'm not going to be talking too much about that in the talk, but it's just one of the things that informs the work that I do. I also just want to make sure that everyone knows that I'm happy to be asked questions. I think that this talk is a great opportunity to provoke discussion, either on my Twitter or wherever you can find me. Ask me questions. I think cultivating safe spaces to talk about these kinds of things is really important. So I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on the things that I have experience of, which is about gender representation, trans inclusivity, and LGBTQ+ representation. But I will be talking about things to do with race and ethnicity, as well as better representation of visible disabilities and designing accessible and inclusive technology too. This is a quote from one of my favorite books and your first book recommendation of the talk, which is from The Politics of Design, which is tools are never completely neutral, and their settings and reflect the cultural bias of the technicians that calibrate them. It's a great book. It's got some amazing reading to do around this topic. I just want to say at this point that I am definitely not an expert on the societal inequalities around race and ethnicity as a white person. So while I can comment on them in a way that I have worked within the bounds of representing race and ethnicity within my design work, I'm not a personal expert because I do not face that discrimination myself. A little bit about where I work. I am a designer at Ushahidi. So Ushahidi is a Kenyan tech NGO, so non-profit. We create various different products. We've got a data collection crowdsourcing product, which is our platform product, where it's been used in lots of different cases. And it was founded in 2007, 2008 around the election violence in Kenya. And it was used to understand what was happening in the areas that were rural and were hardest to reach. So where they were facing discrimination and violence, we wanted to find out how we could raise their voices. We've also got another product called 10-4, which is helping teams reach each other in everyday and in crises. So what this does is it takes lots of different communication methods and it aggregates them into one place. And this was a tool that was created along a similar line. We had a terrorist attack on a mall in Kenya, and we couldn't get in contact with some of our team members. This might be a familiar scenario for many people where we were ringing around and telephone calling some people, we were text messaging other people, we were calling friends of friends who might know where certain people were in the incident. And it took us well over 24 hours to find out whether or not each member of our staff that were at the mall on that weekend were safe. And we decided that on the Monday, when people got back into the office, that we needed to create a tool that would solve this problem. So the kind of work that we do is around marginalized groups, primarily within East African countries. And I want to just mention at the moment that Ushahidi is an incredibly diverse company. It was founded in Kenya. There's a great number of Kenyan and East African and Central African staff. And it's the first company that I've ever felt like I could be out in, which is a really important thing to note. So we're going to move on to illustration and representation in illustration now. So my first junior position was at a company which you may recognize from this image. I worked on their design and their branding and everything to do with their visual representation. And I remember these adverts, these television adverts. So this is a cartoon character that's being presented right now. And I also remember when they introduced a second character and the work that was done around this character. So I remember at the time when I was very junior, very new role, I felt unsettled by this character in a sense that I wasn't sure about how they were being represented within the adverts that we were putting out, especially since a lot of their physical characteristics were made jokes of. So I'm going to describe the slides as I go along. So here we've got a larger Black woman character, which was the new character that was introduced, and the smaller character is kind of being absorbed by her ample chest in this image. And it took me a long time to really figure out why this unsettled me, actually, after I'd left the company. And I think that it was mainly around the fact that I don't think that there were many people of color in the room when these kind of decisions were being made. But I was a junior, I wasn't ready to start having these conversations. And I think this is a really important point to raise within this conversation, which talks about how we can do better visual representation in our design work, but also how difficult those conversations can be. So the idea with illustration is that you should be able to represent people incredibly diversely, since illustration is limited really only by two things, our imaginations and our ability to draw different or create different images. So this is an example of a piece of work that I did when I was much more advanced in my career. This is an illustration that the brief was a family doing a conga line during a Christmas period, and it was for a set of blog images. And I did several different images, and this was the one that I felt like I'm going to push some boundaries here around what I want to represent visually as a family. I want to use lots of different skin tones, I want to use lots of different ages, and I actually want to try and represent some visible disabilities. So this product, just want to mention what kind of product this was for. So this was for a parental tech product. So this was a product where parents could keep in touch with their children and monitor their screen usage and device usage. So these images and these illustrations are aimed at parents all across the world of any background. So you can see here where I mentioned that this one character on the left is a close-up of an older person's ear, a drawn person, and there's some kind of hearing aid type device in that ear. And the person that I've illustrated on the left is wearing a set of darker glasses and carrying a red and white striped cane. And this is usually an indication of somebody with a severe sight and hearing impairment. And this was information that I gathered from people that worked within assistive technology. I showed them these images and I said, how does this represent people? Is this accurate? And I got some confirmation there. So this illustration actually wasn't accepted to be published, but these ones were. So these were the other illustrations that I created for the different blog pieces that were around this. And it raises some interesting questions. It raised interesting questions at the time. So around what we feel comfortable representing in our products as a company, but also as individuals. I raised the question within the company. I said, what's wrong with the image of the family doing the conga line, where other people, the people have the visible impairment devices on them? And I didn't really receive much of a clear answer. I kind of received answers that were along the lines of, oh, maybe we'll not use it next time, or we just didn't have the capacity. We thought that these images were impactful. These kinds of conversations that kind of really skirt around the issue, around just saying we don't feel comfortable taking our brand to this place just yet. And it's sort of edged around statements like, these aren't our target audience, or perhaps this would raise more questions than it would answer. And I think it's important to note at this point that this isn't necessarily an example of a conversation that went well. This was an awkward conversation where I had to make a decision at the moment whether I wanted to escalate this more and insist that it gets used for the reasons that I felt really passionate about. Turns out that I didn't get the opportunity to do as much. It also made me less inclined to introduce other different kinds of representation with the imagery that I did for this company. I was really keen on including people of different ethnicities and also same-sex couples, as they are parents as well. But it turns out that I didn't get the chance to do that after leaving. So this wraps up the section to do with illustration. So I think that the takeaway from this section is that while it's completely valid and you're able to draw anything that you would want to, there's still going to be the questions around whether you can include it. So we're going to move on to photography now. So we've got some issues around stock photography, really, or I'm going to talk a little bit about stock photography, and I'm going to talk about how stock photography can be used for good here. Like, there's clearly an intention from this company to try and represent a diverse set of staff. And what becomes problematic when they're using this is when other companies are using exactly the same picture. And this is actually an example from your second book recommendation of this talk, which is a really great book called Technically Wrong by Sarah Botcher. I'm pretty sure I pronounce her name incorrectly, but apologies, Sarah. It's a great book, and it really covers a lot of these different issues around representation of ethnicity and diversity from these kinds of pulled down stock images. So it can come across as inauthentic, and I think a lot of us know that this is not particularly good practice. But sometimes it's difficult to be finding images that accurately represent the diverse audience that you're looking for. I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that I did at Ushahidi, or a poster project for a partner that we were working with at the time. So this was a poster project This poster was going to be going up in doctors' offices and clinics within Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania. So these posters had a treatment that used the brand and illustration. There's some issues around like the representation of gender here with the illustration work, but I'm going to talk more about when I wanted to introduce photography into the project as well. So the partner organization had a set of photography assets that they were using. They looked like these kinds of images here. And when I got the brief for this poster project, I was like, okay, so what I'll do is go do my investigation design work. I'll use some of the images that the partner uses as well. Those are good images to be using, but I'll also see if I can find some other images. And very quickly, I came up against the issue where I was looking for good representation of young girls in East African countries. And I was getting images that were much more of this kind of description. So the images that were from the partners are images of young girls in school uniforms, and the images that I was finding that I was able to get from stock sites or from resource sites are kind of images of girls in school uniforms, but with a very sort of rural background. It's very sandy, it's got very bare trees, and the girls are carrying buckets and receptacles for water. So I thought about these images, and it gave me that same unsettling feeling that I got way back when I was a junior. And I was like, I think that I want to include images like this as options, but I also kind of want to see what else is going on in the areas that we're going to be putting these posters up in. So I actually went to Instagram. I looked at the hashtag Nairobi, and I looked at all the different hashtags to do with the different cities that these images would be going up in. And I also did a Google image search as well, like, what is Nairobi like, or what are these places like? Because at this point I'd yet not visited and seen for myself. And turns out Nairobi and everywhere else is very much the same kind of visual, like clothing style. People are incredibly diverse looking, and there's not necessarily this imagery that focuses on like a arid landscape and girls in school uniforms isn't necessarily accurate. So what I did was I looked for different images that I could use. I used a stock photography site, spent some time trying to find a good one, and I found some images that I think these match more what I'm seeing on Instagram and Google image search. So I included these as some of my proposals to my colleague. And I actually then had another awkward conversation with my colleague that I massively appreciate, where she looked at the images and said, please don't use the one with the girls and the buckets. It's just not right for this demographic. These here, where there's these older teenage girls in kind of regular casual clothes using modern mobile devices, are much more accurate of what the actual demographic of people that are going to be seeing these posters are like. So I was really glad that I was able to think about this more widely, use Instagram and use Google to look at different images that could be included, and actually had that conversation with my colleague. So that's hopefully a good example of where things have gone well. I also kind of want to talk very briefly about how, as a white person, how I have little to no understanding of the different kinds of things to do with hairstyles around and clothing styles around different countries within Africa. So it really does become much more important to rely on the people that have that experience, live in those countries, the people that you work with. Luckily in Ushahidi, we have people that live and work in those countries, so they can answer our sometimes inexperienced questions about these things, about how to represent people accurately, well, and respectfully. And also around photography of people with darker skin tones, if you're looking to hire a photographer to take pictures, it's really important that they've taken pictures of people of color before, because there's a certain way to light darker skin tones in a very complementary way. And there's definitely considerations to be taken around how a good piece of photography is set up. So I also did this exercise with the subject of my preference, which is around LGBTQ representation. And I was really afraid at first to put the search term result of trans person into a stock photography site. But thankfully, there was actually some really good results that I got. I was really impressed with the descriptions. So one of the descriptions of these pieces of photography was a portrait of a female transgender with brown hair looking away, which I think is a really accurate and good description of some of these images that were coming up. But I think there was also some problematic imagery here. So here we've got a slide which shows like the pride flag, rainbow flags, and some images around like the transgender symbol, but then also some other symbols like what we would typically consider the female symbol and the male symbol with the little plus and the arrow sign. But also some images around that make me feel uncomfortable as a person within this community. So we've got some images to do with like secrecy and how like different bodies are being represented. And I think, again, you have to make your own choice about how you feel about these images. But what I feel that this does is, if I was a person, much like with the previous example, where I didn't know particularly in detail how to represent people accurately from those countries in those settings, that if I was not as ingrained within this community, that I wouldn't necessarily think that these aren't good images to use. I've put in a search term, these results have come up, but there's a responsibility here, I think, from photographers and stock photography websites to make sure that we're accurately serving up stock photography that will be respectful when used by companies that perhaps won't necessarily know any better. But there are ways, again, to check. Use Instagram hashtags, use your community, ask LGBTQ plus groups whether these images would be acceptable to use when trying to represent that community well. And it also talks about these kinds of issues around what we perceive a trans or lesbian or gay person's characteristics to be. And there's this really big question that I have with multiple people after doing this talk around, are any visual representations of marginalized groups ever not going to be problematic because of what wider society sees as like the signs of that group or that representation group? So are the characteristics which we rely on for good representation are also the ones that further marginalize people? Again, that's not necessarily a question that I've got an answer to at the moment, which is it's still in progress. And this is especially important when you see people that are non-binary, trans, and gender fluid are so hugely varied in their like physical characteristics. Here we've got a slide with a few different famous non-binary, gender fluid, and trans people. We've got Buck Angel, we've got Courtney Act, we've got Aidan Dowling, we've got Carmen Carrera, we've got Jack Monroe, and we've got Ryan. They're actually forgotten Ryan's last name, but they are a musician. And they're so visually like characteristically diverse. So here is a slide of good resources where I think that these are sites that I've used for good stock photography. So we've got a website called African Stock Photo, which I've had some good success in. Photoability.net is actually, I think, a really good resource for images of people with disabilities, usually visible disabilities, and actually kind of focuses much more on wheelchairs. Women of color in tech
So it looks like we've had some technical difficulties. Eriol, are you back on?
I am back on. Apologies.
Excellent.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what's happened there.
Don't worry. We'll let you continue.
Okay. So sorry about that, technical difficulties there, but I was just talking about I'll just go back to the last slide, which is the really good photo resources here. And then I was just talking a little bit about the good representation that meetup.com uses. They use their real users in their real environments, and they use these on their website. So what I think that this is a good example of is using those real people. It's not what a lot of people you could describe it as not necessarily a great piece of photography, but it's authentic and it's real. And I think one of the things that it shows us is how important real people, your real users, are in this involving them in this process. So even if you're going to use stock photography, you can still ask them whether they think that it's accurate to use. So I'm going to speed up a bit now, and I'm going to talk about UX and UI. This is actually a real example of when I was asked to take into consideration this statement of feminizing the experience. This is for the parental product again. And really, this question around feminizing an experience came about because we had what was considered less female or mothers using our product. And we sort of moved around the conversation around making it more female friendly. We talked about making it all pink, which makes me cringe. But really, after having quite a long and awkward conversation with my colleagues, it was more about the fact that the product was built by a technical person to begin with, and that it was very unreadable, very techy, looked like a technical product as opposed to a lifestyle product, one that you could use really easily, use for a few minutes a day at a time, and that had some really simple functions. So when I was asked to just make it more female friendly, I replied with, why not just friendly without the female part? So we worked on making the interface less cluttered and moved more towards a application where you could use it really, really quickly and easily within your everyday life when you're really busy. So this kind of stuff, I think, around feminizing experiences or making experiences or products more masculine, I think comes about from these problems around marketing and how things make money. And we can all recognize some of these funny sort of images here, which we've got examples of the hashtag fragile masculinity so fragile. And this is an image of, we've got men's tea, we've got chapstick for men, we've got, I think it's sunscreen, factor 50 for men, and then we've got men's cotton swabs, which are the things you clean your ears with. But they're for men only, it seems, in this image. And I find these quite ridiculous, and they're funny. They kind of should be funny, and they come from a problematic sort of advertising and marketing background. The history of these kinds of items is really fascinating. But why I like to focus on them here and talk about them in the wider conversation around user experience is that what it suggests is that certain people shouldn't be buying these products or shouldn't be using these products, when really everybody should be using our products if they are relevant to them. And I find tissues particularly interesting because we've got man-sized tissues, and then we've got the other tissues which are ultra soft, as you can see down the bottom, but the man-sized ones aren't. And it perplexes me as to why anybody would want their tissues not to be extra soft. Presumably you've got a sore nose and a cold at the time, so you'd want to be using the softest tissue possible. And around this kind of idea, it kind of amused me to think that there might be a situation where there could be non-binary tissues at some point, or trans tissues. Is this a kind of both ridiculous, but also is this a direction that could possibly happen in the future? I mean, it's ridiculous to think that there is a marketing opportunity here when really what we want to be doing, as the slide says here, is make something usable, relevant, and simple for anyone to use, regardless of your gender, regardless of these like marketing or advertising characteristics. One of the conversations I had around this is around fitness apps, actually. So I've got some images here of fitness applications using different body shapes and body types. So we've got sort of like a standard, what we would consider standard kind of muscular, rectangular male figure. And then we've got a slightly more curvy, but still muscular female figure. And I was talking to somebody who was making a fitness app at the time, and they were saying, how can I make this not gendered? Like, we don't want to exclude people from using our fitness apps, because we want to recognize that not everybody has a body shape which can be categorized as such. And I thought, what an interesting problem to have. I suggested at the time that why would you need to prescribe any kind of physical shape or characteristic to a gender? Or you could go the other direction and make it so fully customizable that people can choose what their body shape and type is. Because after all, as well, not all men are shaped like our sort of rectangular muscular shape, and not all women are that kind of hourglass shape. There's such a huge variety in body shapes, even when you do identify as the gender that was assigned at birth. That more options and more flexibility doesn't make for a poorer product, it makes for a more inclusive product. I'm going to talk a little bit now about form fields to do with UI and UX, because I feel like these examples really focus on some of the issues that come up with the LGBT plus community. So it's one of my favorite things to screenshot as well as I go through. So this section includes quite a lot of good tips that you can integrate into your workflow at the moment. So what we've got here is actually another awkward conversation I had with workmates around selecting your gender when you are selecting a student accommodation. So what we've got here on the screen is a mandatory field that is signified by the asterisk, and it says your gender. We've got options of male, female, and then not specified. Then not specified says that you basically don't want to share your gender with your potential future flatmates. So when I was asking questions around this form field, I was like, okay, well, what if you want to choose your gender, but also you don't want it to be shared with your flatmates? Or what if you what are the options here? Like, what is it actually, like, what if you want to know what this information is used for as well? There's not actually extra information to be given to the users here. And why is it mandatory? And some of the answers I got were absolutely startling. So the actual function of this form field is that when you pick your gender, you are typically placed into a flat which has maybe got 5 to 6 bedrooms, and you're placed with your gender that you've identified as. So I was thinking, oh, okay, so why don't people want to select the gender that they would prefer to live with? And the awkward conversation sort of meandered around this statement around students' focus on their studies, and perhaps if they're living with the opposite sex, they perhaps might not focus as much. And I, at one point, kind of had to come out with what do you think that there's going to be sort of sexual relations that are happening within these student flats? And again, it was an awkward conversation that was had between people, and I kind of raised the point after much mumbling around, well, do you not think that there's the potential of distraction and sexual relations to happen in same gendered flats? You know, people that are gay do exist. And it was actually incredibly surprising to my workmates to hear that information. But I find it surprising, again, considering that so many more young people nowadays are identifying outside of the gender spectrum, the binary gender spectrum, and also identifying more as, bisexual and gay and lesbian, as well as straight. So there's so much more open identities out there for young people, especially as a student accommodation website. There needs to be a real recognition of who you're serving here. On to another problem that I often have as a person who changed their legal name to their preferred name, which matches more of a gender neutral name. Please avoid using the term real name versus things like preferred name or legal name or the name that you used to go by. I don't think it's bad to trip up on this sometimes, but also be aware of what kind of message that using real name sends. And also, if you really require a matching ID alongside somebody's name tag, please allow them to identify their preferred name and then maybe their ID name that will need to be checked. So often I register for conferences and I'm worried that I'll get rejected at the door because my preferred name on the badge doesn't match my legal name in my identification. We've also got some talk around Mr., Miss and Mrs. now and the different ways of identifying outside of these titles. So this was a long message that I sent to customer support, which is, please close the account. I am registering a new name change, and please add MX to your title list options because it's now a legal option for the UK. So this has been used since the early 1980s, and it's now widely accepted by the government. So it's definitely something for companies and anyone that wants to capture this information to include. But also I would suggest, why are you capturing title information if you're also capturing name information? It begs this question around, like, what information are you capturing and for what purpose? If you don't need it, then you can save the space on your form fields in your UI and your user experiences. I also kind of wondered, with this example here, we've got a doctor male and a doctor female, which I find quite perplexing as to the distinctions there. And just bear in mind that there are, as well as titles, there are things as such as pronouns. So I use they, them pronouns, but there are a huge number of different pronouns that people use. So you can have things like sie, their, and fey and fair, as well as they and them, and he and him, and she and hers. So there's lots of different ways that people can use pronouns, and it's always good to give them the option of self-identifying. So we're going to talk a little bit about forms that do self-identifying at the moment, and I've got some of these examples from an amazing article done by Sarai, which is titled Respectful Collection of Demographic Data, and that's on Medium. It's an absolutely amazing article that covers some of these issues as well. So it's about on the left-hand side, we've got a difference between a checkbox list for ethnicity and a radio button list for ethnicity. And checkbox is always preferred because you can identify as multiple different ethnicities, not just one. It's the same. So with gender, around choosing an option which is prefer not to say or none of your business, I always suggest to people, hey, I really want to say, because for the longest time, for more than 10 years, I wasn't able to say. I wasn't out with people or the public. And now I'm proud to be able to say that my gender is non-binary. And I'm proud to be able to advocate for that. So instead of giving me a none of your business or prefer not to say, give me the option to select like an other, and then give me the option to self-identify with a text box, because I really want to tell you. And that's amazing data to be gathering as a company, I think, as well. So some examples here of some really great forums on how to include MX and how to include suggestions around your gender pronouns. You can add them in the text here, and different ways of being able to suggest how people identify, how people think of themselves. So we've got a suggestion around at birth you were described as male, female, intersex, or prefer not to say. And then we've also got another question which is around, like, how do you identify now? So I'm going to talk really quickly about edge cases, and this has become a lot better in more recent years, I think. You know, it used to be very much, when I would hear edge cases within the design work that I was doing, I would hear we can't please everyone, and that was really connected to things like time and money, from my experience. And I feel like what this historically did was it really limited what designers and developers could do in the early stages of a project to be spending time, money, and effort around including the people that needed our help the most, or needed inclusion the most. And I desperately want to move away from using edge cases as a vocabulary and more towards what a lot of people are now using, which is stress cases. So this is also known as, I like to think, the people that need our empathy and attention the most. I often hear a lot of different people asking me after this talk, and when we're talking about these kinds of things, about how they can convince their boss or convince people that this is the kind of work that they should be spending the time on, that time and money around edge cases. There's a lot of different things out there that you can draw upon. I mean, there's an ethical responsibility to be inclusive, but we can also look at some of these statistics around like how people identify as different genders and the kind of different stressful situations that people can get on social media. So like the people that try to think we're degenerate, or that it's a mental disorder in need of help, the way that we identify. And I'd like to, at this point, note that when I get to self-identify on a forum, it just gives me such a beautiful, happy feeling that I have such a positive reaction to whatever is capturing that form, that I think that it's so useful for a company to be doing, really. Like, you're making people feel valid and happy by allowing them to self-identify. And you really, there's a responsibility around like keeping people safe. So there's a do no harm in design and development and with tech products. And there is such a sad reality that people that are marginalized are so much more likely to take their own lives or be victims of different hate crimes, that the small things that we can do within our tech products really can make all the difference to their lives. And it goes back to this question, well, this statement around making things simple, usable, and relevant for everyone. And I've got a statement here that I'd just like to read out. I think it's a good one to be taking back to our colleagues. It's, as designers, we're at the forefront of how products serve users, but also how the digital and physical world represents and reflects back at users. We have a responsibility to be inclusive, sensitive, and understanding with what we design, and endeavour to help non-marginalised folk foster their acceptance and expose them to systems that include rather than exclude. So that's about having these conversations with people and helping the education process go along within our jobs, but within any kind of situation where we can advocate for this. So I'd like to also sort of mention that I give myself most of the time a C+ for inclusion, maybe a B if I'm feeling nice. I make a lot of mistakes, and I think this is a really important thing to draw on, that making mistakes is often an important part of inclusivity and diversity. And here are some suggestions on different things that you can do around trying to encourage these kind of conversations. So you can ask other people when it's safe and encouraged to do so. So go along to different meetups, read widely. When you go along to these meetups for perhaps marginalized groups, make sure that you ask before you go along. And respect their boundaries and be prepared to apologize if you do make a mistake. And making mistakes is an important part of the learning process around this. You can talk about issues not just with the marginalized people. Marginalized people get a lot of pressure put upon them to do the education process as well as the advocacy for themselves. And practice compassion with that. And question your words and assumptions that you use, and think about why and where these come from. So when we use the greeting, hey guys, think about the different ways that you can greet a group of people. So you can, hey folks, hey people, hey team, hey friends. There's so many different words that you can use other than guys. And I think the important thing to draw upon this is not everyone in the group that you're addressing will be a guy. And sometimes that might be a really difficult thing that they're dealing with at that particular moment. There's also things about ableist language. So I hear a lot like around statements like, oh, this website is so crazy, or this is mental, or something like that. And really, it's such a difficult one to eliminate from our vocabulary. But really what you're trying to say is like, this website is messy, or this website is disorganized. So try and avoid using that ableist language around mental health problems. And finally, here is your reading list of lots of different things that I recommend that you read to get more information about things to do with gender identities and how to do better visual representation, and how tech products can be biased in what they're doing. So these slides will be up on a sharing site as well, so you can get these links afterwards. And that's me done.
Well, Eriol, thank you so much. It's rare to listen to a talk where I certainly feel I've come away so much better off for having spent some time. And thank you for sharing, some just really practical tips, your experiences, and helping people the many people I suspect, like me, who are out there who want to do the right thing by all groups of people, but sometimes stumble, feel a bit uncertain about it. This has, certainly helped me, and I'm sure it will lots of other people too. Joe, how are we looking on questions?
So we've not had any come through on the Twitter, but I've actually had a couple that I've written down while I've been listening, and that talk was amazing, Errol. I really enjoyed it too. So one of the things that I wanted to ask was if people are concerned after having heard that talk, and maybe they're thinking, my form isn't very great, or the photos that we've got on our website perhaps aren't inclusive, how should they get that conversation started with their team? Do you have any advice or recommendations who they should talk to, the sort of things that they should start bringing up?
Do you know what? I mean, I'm an advocate of good reading materials. There's so these examples on the screen right now of different reading materials, what I would often do in different places, I would share articles around digitally on my Slack team groups. I would take in my books sometimes and kind of leave them on my desk, and then people would ask me questions about them sometimes, because I think as humans we're inherently interested in how each of us represents ourselves to the outside world. I think that it'd be naive to say that we don't have sort of like a deep interest in the othering of people, right? And I don't think this always comes from a place. Sometimes it comes from a discriminatory place, but sometimes it comes out of this genuine curiosity about wanting to understand each other more. And I think that those ways are good ways of introducing the topics to a team that might be afraid of them. So sharing around different articles, but also going along to, there's so many more meetups and events that are happening nowadays around diversity, around inclusion. And there are always local meetups, I think, in typically in major cities, if you're able to get to them, they're around like LGBT and tech groups, or in my local city of Bristol, there's a Proud Bristol meetup, which is around people that are just in business but LGBT, and they talk a lot about how coming out in the workplace is its own difficult situation, and how actually the statistics of how the money lost by people not being out in work through productivity levels is actually incredibly staggering. So I would, if you're cautious about raising these topics in work, I would start with some of the literature and see how that goes. Actually, there was an amazing project that was done by Lloyds Bank. I went to the last Stonewall conference that happened earlier this year, and they did an amazing project around mental health and getting people to talk more about mental health in the workplace. And it was actually pioneered, spearheaded by a person who is a bisexual man. And a lot of his work around including mental health conversations at work also coincided with how he really struggled to come out at work within that environment. And a lot of these things we talk a fair bit about intersectionality, but a lot of these things are intertwined. And that's definitely a project to look at, about how a big corporation, like a big bank, has included conversations around mental health and sexuality within their wider comms. If you're feeling particularly brave, you can ask to talk about a specific image. You can do with the last talk around user testing, I'm a huge advocate of putting images, putting designs in front of people, especially the demographics that you want to include more, and asking them their opinions on it, and saying, does this accurately represent you? Because they'll tell you, as long as you give them the opportunity to tell them and give them the safe place to tell you, then they will, and that information is valuable.
I love that. Yeah, that's great. I think that's all my questions. We've not had anything else come through on the Twitter so far.
Cool. No worries. Like I said, I think that this topic, sometimes the questions that I've been asked after I've done this talk a lot of the time people want to have them one-on-one. And I just want to reiterate that my direct messages on both Twitter and LinkedIn are completely open. You can ask for my email address. We can find a way for you to anonymously ask questions as well. But I think that one of the important things is to encourage this safe space where questions can be answered. And sometimes the ones that we think that we shouldn't be asking, but we can, and that there can be a compassionate way that we can help that process of learning.
That's wonderful. Thank you again, Eriol. A quick reminder to everybody that ID24 is brought to you in partnership with the Paciello Group, Barclays Access, Intopia, Microsoft Edge, and Open Access Technologies, and with thanks to our sponsors, DQ Systems. If you liked Eriol's talk, please head over to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 and hit that like button. And while you're there, why not subscribe to and let us know you're out there supporting this community event. We'll be back on the hour with Almira Spain, who is going to be talking about killing accessibility with 5 words. So don't go away. We'll see you on the hour.